Welcome to the All-Star Planning Podcast. My name is Kelsey, and this is the place where I talk all things teacher lesson plans. Today, we are talking about one of my favorite things ever, unit plans. I know, it sounds crazy. No one ever tells you that you need to write unit plans. My admin doesn't collect unit plans. They only collect lesson plans, but this is like an extra bonus piece that I do that I don't know many others do, but it has 1000% streamlined my lesson planning process. Now, in my opinion, a unit is like 1 to 4 weeks of lessons, and it's all based on one umbrella topic. And at the end of that unit, there's going to be some type of formal assessment to see how the kids learned. Of course, there's mini assessments throughout, but at the end, formal assessment, in some cases, that is going to be a project, a portfolio, a report. For many of us, it is tests. Whatever it is, there is some type of formal assessment at the end. For me, it's usually labs in their lab portfolio and then a written test with a combination of multiple choice and short answer questions. Never true false. We'll get into that another day. I'm not a true false person. So that's what a unit is. My unit plan on paper starts out with a unit summary, which is just explaining, like, to a layman what my kids would be learning in chemistry. I have some enduring understandings, which I call them big ideas. They're just like the bigger topics that kids are going to leave the unit knowing. And then I just have a grid. I do this in a grid. I am a grid person. I have my lessons numbered. Then I have the standards that pair with a lesson. I have skills that pair, and then I have learning targets, which for me is really just a summary of the standards written in kid language. I'll give you an example. Let's say the standard is, I don't know, an atom can become a cation by losing electrons, and an atom can become an anion by gaining electrons. That's the standard, right? Let's just say that's the chemistry standard. My learning target, I would take that and translate that into something that made sense to a kid. And I always put it in an I can statement. I know that not everybody does that. I'm a huge proponent of first person I can statements because it just puts it in kid language. So I would say, I can determine the number of electrons lost or gained based on charge. And that would maybe be my learning target. Because the kids don't need to know all of the crazy technical language. They just need like a checklist. Yes, I can do this. Yes, I can do that. It doesn't need to be crazy. So I have all that listed, and my lessons are numbered. I have said it, I think, 15 times, and this is, the 4th episode of the podcast? I think that your lessons should be numbered. They need to be in some type of order because you want your lessons to kind of flow one into the next, and this is where the unit plan helps you. When you take all of your standards and you chop them into their categories, and you find 30 standards all about the atom, when you go and write your atoms unit, you have to break those standards into a certain number of lessons. Maybe 10 lessons, maybe 30 lessons, whatever works for you and for your calendar. But those standards are going to help you to sequence because typically your easier standards go towards the beginning and your more complex standards go towards the end of a unit because you kind of build, right? So for me, I teach the history and the structure of the atom in the beginning, and then we get into the manipulations of the atom, the way that atoms interact with each other. That is more complex than the structure, so the structure comes in the beginning. When I do this, it kind of outlines how many lessons are going to be in my unit, and then I can plug in lab activities where it's needed. So the sequence, I think, helps the most because when you have a good proper sequence where one lesson flows into the next, you spend less time backtracking and reteaching because you have kind of like built, think of it like a pyramid, like your basics are on the bottom and then your intermediate skills and then your toughest skills at the top. You're kind of building your way up to the toughest and most complex things. And because you're doing it in a unit plan, everything is based on the same topic. For instance, when I'm doing my atoms unit, I'm not bringing in a bunch of random periodic table standards or random bonding standards, because I want to focus on just one thing at a time. Now, for me with chemistry, my entire first semester is really, really cumulative. And then the second semester, not so much. So I let my kids know this, that if they're struggling in the beginning, they need to get help in the beginning. And that's because my units are cumulative for the first semester. And then my second semester, when I do, it's really just applied chemistry. It's how chemistry applies to the real world. And then we look at it through a different lens for each unit. So we would look at acids and bases. Then we look at kinetics. And I know most of you are probably not chemistry teachers, but it's important for me to know what units are cumulative and which ones are not, because then I can use that to help my students navigate their learning. You see what I mean? And then it also helps for me in sequencing my units. Once I have those plans written, I know which units are the easier ones and which ones are the more complex ones, and then I can take those unit plans and just put like my 14 of them in order. And it's actually pretty straightforward. Which one comes first? That's the measurement one. So really I just have to take the remaining 13 and put them in order. And my first year, I just copied the order from my student teaching experience, and it didn't really work for me. So my second year, I had written out all of these plans, and it was so much easier to sequence and think about what came first, second, and third, because I had the plans to work with. So actually what wound up happening was that my second unit became my 7th unit. And that sounds kind of crazy, but that's exactly what happened. And for the most part, it was the same, but that switch really changed things for me. I wound up looking at my units as micro units, things that looked at like the basics of chemistry and the structure of atoms, and then macro, which was how chemistry applied to the real world. So there's lots of different ways to look at your units. I know that history teachers for a very long time were teaching chronologically, like this is the 11th century, then the 12th, then the 13th, and they had to kind of teach in order. And now I think history is kind of transitioning into more of a thematic thing. So you would talk about revolutions, and then you would talk about revolutions all over the world, no matter the time period, because there's data that shows that that's a cool way to learn, a better way to learn. I don't know, I'm not a history person, but I think that that's pretty cool. You can learn about the similarities between all of the revolutions and how people used history to learn, right? The American Revolution was inspired by the French Revolution, or was it vice versa? I don't quite remember, but I do know that people inspire others throughout the world, and that I think is an excellent lens to look at history. So just by sequencing your units, you've changed the entire outlook of your course, perhaps. So it's definitely something that I would consider, especially because with your unit plans, the biggest piece for me is that you are only working with like 10 to 30 standards at a time, and then you use those to plan your units instead of writing a lesson plan and having to go search through, in my case, 189 standards and skills to figure out what it is exactly on that standards to-do list that you are teaching. So that is all I have for you today in terms of your unit plans. If you haven't already signed up for the masterclass, you should, because it's about how all of these planning pieces fit together. You can find that at plan.kelseyreevy.com. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can find it in the link in the video description bar. You can also find links to it all over my website, kelseyreevy.com, and subscribe to the podcast. Did I say subscribe? Subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of my secrets. Talk to you soon. Happy planning.